I wanted to analyze this Noam Chomsky video in which he's talking about poor people in the United States and how they are potentially manipulated. He talks about globalization and the impact that it's had on them.
My question has to do with the category of globalization and worker fear, as you mentioned in your speech. Your thoughts on the offshoring of technology jobs and also the H-1B visas, 1.3 million in the last 3 years that have displaced technology workers here in the U.S., including me?
Well, actually, there's an interesting op-ed in the New York Times about this morning by a very good economist, Jagdish Bhagwati, who's also not only a fine economist, but a very decent person who really wants to help the poor and has done important things. And what he's saying is that people who are objecting to outsourcing just don't have their economics straight. If they understood economics, they would know it's a good thing. And why is it a good thing? Well, because it increases efficiency, and efficiency increases the economic pie, and that's good for all of us. And if you don't allow corporations to outsource, they may.
So Chomsky brings up a good point in highlighting that just because the economic pie overall is bigger does not mean that it benefits all people. You can have a bigger pie, but if the wealthy take 4/5 of the pie, where before they took 3/4, then people are still going to be worse off, even if it's bigger. Chomsky highlights these kinds of ideas. And in globalization, that's literally what is happening, is you are having the wealthiest individuals are literally able to make more money than ever before. Even if the pie grows bigger, they get a larger slice of it.
Of overcoming this. Well, everything he says is true in some abstract model of the international economy, which has absolutely no resemblance to reality. But in that model, it's true, and you can probably prove a theorem about it. In the actual economy, it's very innovative, but not because of private enterprise. It's innovative, yes, because of massive state intervention, exactly what's blocked for everyone else by the so-called globalization rules. So we're going to do it because we do anything we like, but others can't do it. Furthermore, that's the whole history of the modern world. That's why India was a disaster and Britain became rich. It's because of those relationships. And so it goes. So in the real world, yes, we're innovative, but not for his reasons. Furthermore, even on his own terms, objecting to let's take this abstract model that he's talking about. Suppose that corporations die in the United States. Well, it just means they're inefficient. So that means that he and I and you can all get kicked out of our institutions because they're just not competitive, and we can apply for jobs as janitors at 80 hours a week, no pay, or get locked into factories and so on, by factories owned in more efficient places like Thailand and China and so on. Maybe that'll increase the economic pie, So why not advocate that? I mean, who cares if the corporations here die? Furthermore, the outsourcing has nothing to do with economic efficiency. Outsourcing is one of the operations that take place within command economies. The economy is run by a network of command economies called corporations. I mean, what goes on internal to a corporation or a mega corporation is not free trade. It's command economy. A corporation is a totalitarian institution. It has a board of directors at the top, a manager, he gives orders, everyone else follows them down at the bottom. At the very bottom, if you're lucky, you can rent yourself to it and get a job. And if you're sufficiently propagandized, you may even buy some of the junk they produce and so on. But it's certainly has nothing to do with what any classical economist would have called a free market. Outsourcing is just part of the technique. Outsourcing is internal to the corporation, right? The corporation picks some supplier to outsource to and keeps them under control, because then they can get much cheaper labor hideous working conditions, don't have to worry about environmental controls. They get inputs to themselves, which are very cheap. That increase, for those of you who've studied economics, you know that increases productivity. If you get artificially cheap inputs, that increases productivity, because productivity is measured in terms of, value produced divided by the number of workers. So you get nice measures of productivity, which have nothing to do with productivity. They just have to do with the fact that you've got...
Chomsky brings up how outsourcing, often though it can save a business a lot of money, they are doing it in a way that many could argue is less than ethical, as they have horrible working conditions in areas like India, Bangladesh, China. So you have people that are working in these factories making a couple dollars a day, filthy working conditions, sometimes very unsafe working conditions. You have American workers that are negatively impacted, while it is increasing the profits of the corporations.
Themselves, which are very cheap. That increase, for those of you who've studied economics, you know that increases productivity. If you get artificially cheap inputs, that increases productivity, because productivity is measured in terms of, value produced divided by the number of workers. So you get nice measures of productivity, which have nothing to do with productivity. They just have to do with the fact that you've got 20-year-old women off the farms in China locked into factories and working until they die in a couple of years. That is very healthy for the economy. But it's all internal to big command economies. That's one of the reasons why the concept trade is so ridiculous. I mean, what's called trade would certainly not have been called trade by Adam Smith. Outsourcing happens to send goods across the border into the United States, but it's under the control of a command economy. In fact, a network of command economies, which work the way I just quoted, the oligopolistic competition and strategic integration. And the same is true of most of what's called trade. I mean, nobody really studies this much, so you don't have really accurate numbers. But if you take the numbers that are guessed at by economists who look at it, take, say, NAFTA. One of the great things about NAFTA is supposed to have been that it increased trade between the U.S. and Mexico. Well, it certainly increased cross-border transfers of material objects. But is that trade? Well, it depends. It turns out that the percentage of interaction that's intra-firm, internal to a command economy, went from about 50% before NAFTA to about 2/3 after NAFTA. That's not trade any more than if GM shifts something from Indiana to Illinois. Happens across an international border so that you can take advantage of rotten working conditions and low wages and no environmental constraints, but it's no more trade than if the Kremlin moved something from Poland to Hungary or something like that. And in fact, it's very possible, if anybody ever bothered to study it, that actual trade has even declined since NAFTA. I mean, nobody studies it because it's the wrong questions to ask, in the ideological framework that we're supposed to accept. But if you did ask it, you might very well find that, just as it turns out after NAFTA that, another great thing about NAFTA for Mexico is that foreign investment shot up, which it did. But a little footnote is that total investment declined because Mexican investment declined even faster than foreign investment went up, for the simple reason that Mexican businesses can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. Corporate systems. So when you go back to the outsourcing story, it's just, in an abstract world, what he's describing is true. In the real world, it just has nothing to do with what's going on. Should we approve of it? Well, that's not the only question. There are other options. For example, another option is to work to improve working conditions, labor standards, environmental conditions, and so on in the places to which they are outsourcing. Okay, that'll tend to equalize the conditions. Is that a utopian measure? Not at all. It's been used. You take a look at the European Union. Before the European Union integrated, substantial efforts were made and substantial costs were assumed to raise the level of the poorer countries, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, to raise labor standards, raise wages, improve conditions, enough, and get to the northern standards, but enough so that when they finally integrated, there wasn't a very severe blow against the wages and living standards of northern workers. Well, that's because they have a kind of social market economy and a more or less functioning democratic system. And the same could have been done with regard to NAFTA. In fact, it was proposed by the U.S. labor movement, but never entered the discussion. And the same, because corporate media are against it and the elites are against it, and the same could be true of the whole outsourcing story. So there are other options. It's not either let the command economies maximize their own profit and power, or else you don't have a job. There are other options.
So towards the end, he highlights that NAFTA could have been created in a way that would be looking out for all workers. He highlights that the European Union, they worked it out to make sure that the poorer countries, that their labor standards were raised, and that unions in the United States, the individuals in labor, they were trying to advocate for this with NAFTA, but he claims that some of the corporate elites didn't go along with it. I want to talk about the concept of elites. You watch Fox News, you watch Sean Hannity, you watch Tucker Carlson, they talk all the time about liberal elites. What they don't mention is that they are on the side of the wealthiest individuals in the country. To the working class, they try and paint this image of liberal elites, indicating individuals that are really well educated, while some of those educated individuals don't even have a fraction of the wealth and power that some of Fox News's biggest contributors and supporters have. So really we have to ask ourselves, who are the elites?